Why don't we jump right into kind of talking about who Rosa Parks is, um, and kind of establish a more radical vision of who she is. So I think, Rosa Parks is a woman who, as a little girl, she's raised in a family where her grandfather would stay up all night on the porch sometimes with his rifle, guarding against the Ku Klux Klan, and she would stay up all night with him. And when she's a young girl, a white boy threatens to beat her up, and she picks up a brick and dares him to. And when she's a young woman, she marries a man named Raymond Parks, and he would hold secret meetings sometimes in their house that were heavily armed. And then she joins the NAACP and is doing pretty dangerous work, to my understanding, sometimes, especially around supporting women who have um, suffered some kind of violent white supremacist attack that often involved rape. And she would sometimes go out to their homes and investigate the issues and really put herself in these very dangerous situations. And yet we don't really hear those stories about her. We think about her soft spokenness and her humility. And I'm wondering, despite, how could such a famous woman, um, how could we not know her full history? How could we not know how radical she is? Why has she been framed outside of that kind of, outside of Flubbin here, outside of how radical she was?
Well, let me put it to you this way. In my way of thinking about it, this country likes a moderate, centered sort of history. Radicalism, revolutionary sort of struggles is not sort of centered. We like a more consensus sort of history. And in terms of thinking about the role of Rosa Parks in sort of the larger Black freedom movement and her role in the Montgomery bus boycott, not only is she an activist before the Montgomery bus boycott, but even after she relocates to Detroit, she remains active in the freedom struggle. And so I think, in my way of thinking about it, she's a long distance freedom, fighter. She fights throughout her life, and what we tend to isolate is a particular moment, and where she becomes world famous, and then she doesn't really have control over the image. She doesn't have control over the way the history is written. And fortunately, today there are enough historians out there who have, dug up the past, and we now have, full documentation of the range of her social activism, especially against sort of anti-rape activism in the NAACP, a lot of her activism around sort of voting and all this other kind of activity that she was associated with. And so I think in the 50s in particular, there's this effort to what I would call defang the radicalism of Black protests. And so the real radicals, sort of, people like Du Bois and W.E.B. Du Bois or Paul Robeson, who had sort of left connections that extended, to, working with sort of communists and the like. So that whole movement was sort of like lopped off because, what they wanted to do was to create historians sort of a centrist sort of view and sort of a more moderate view. And so that was sort of the way that the history was framed. The other thing is that women's activism and women's roles have been sort of subdued, and they have been undercut, and they have been denied and silenced in a lot of ways. And so the full extent of her activism is part of that larger struggle to recognize and integrate within the larger framework the roles of women, especially the roles of African American women, not only in African American history, but in sort of a more radical revisioning of the history. And she's absolutely crucial for that. And when I was growing up, we got the notion that she sat down because her feet were tired or something like this,
Mm-hmm.
and that it but with no sense of sort of a history of individual activism, and the way in which her individual activism was part of a larger community of activism in Montgomery.